We were supposed to take on the world together. That's what she said the night we opened the wine bar, our tiny dream carved out of savings and sacrifices, with laughter echoing off the bare brick walls and promise in every glass we poured. We painted the space ourselves, labeled bottles with silly names, told everyone we were soul sisters with a vision. But promises mean nothing when there's money involved. I trusted her. I believed her when she said this was for life, that we'd never let greed come between us. Until one morning, the account was empty, the keys were gone, and so was she. No call, no note, just silence and a balance of zero. I lost everything that day, the business, the trust, and the version of me that still believed friendship was unbreakable. I had to start over, rebuild from ashes while people whispered about betrayal and bad decisions. Years passed, and I thought I'd buried the pain deep enough not to feel it anymore. But fate has a strange way of circling back. One morning, I walked into my office, my new business, my name on the wall, and there she was, sitting in the waiting area with a resume in her hand and desperation in her eyes. She needed a loan. She had no idea whose desk she was about to sit across from. And she had no idea I hadn't forgotten a single thing she took from me. My name is Liana Mercer, and I was 26 years old the day my best friend drained our business account and disappeared like I never existed. We were more than just partners. We were inseparable. Two young women who had dreamed of building something from scratch, something that would prove we were more than what people expected of us. I had believed in her so completely that I never questioned the way she handled the money or how she insisted the financial side was her strength. I just kept working, pouring my heart into the business, thinking loyalty meant safety. But the day I opened that empty account, I learned that trust could be the sharpest blade. It took everything I had to recover, to believe in myself again, to rebuild without bitterness consuming me. And just when I thought I had left it all behind, she returned, not with an apology, but with a favor to ask. We met in college on the first day of orientation, both of us wide-eyed and carrying too many notebooks, searching for the same lecture hall and laughing at how lost we were. Her name was Paige, and from the moment we exchanged awkward smiles and schedules, we were inseparable. We studied late nights in coffee shops, cried through breakups, dreamed out loud about one day owning a place that felt like ours, where people would come not just for wine or food, but for warmth. Paige was magnetic. People noticed her when she walked in a room. She had this ease about her that I always admired, like nothing could touch her, like the world would always make space. I was quieter, more methodical, more comfortable behind spreadsheets than social scenes, but we balanced each other. When she said, "Let's open that wine bar we always talked about," I hesitated, but she didn't. She had a way of making impossible things feel within reach. We pooled our savings, took out a modest loan, and rented a small storefront on a corner that barely got foot traffic. We made it beautiful, stripped paint off old furniture, designed the logo together, sourced local wines from family vineyards. We called it Poor Decisions, a name that made people laugh and come inside. At first, it was slow. We barely broke even, but we were happy. She handled the vendors, the payments, the taxes, leave that boring stuff to me. She always said, while I ran the front, trained staff, managed marketing. When things finally started picking up, I remember thinking, we're doing it. We're actually doing it. We hosted poetry nights, music evenings, even tiny wedding receptions. It wasn't glamorous, but it was ours. I didn't see the signs at first. The little changes, her coming in late, texting in corners, suddenly avoiding certain conversations about budgets or expansion plans. I thought maybe she was just tired. We were both stretched thin. One day, I suggested hiring an accountant so we could focus more on growth. She brushed it off, saying it would be a waste of money. I let it go. I always let it go. Then, one Tuesday morning, I came in early to place a wine order and noticed the register report didn't match our sales. I opened the bank account and my blood went cold. There was nothing. Not a low balance. Not a flagged transaction. Nothing. Completely drained. I called Paige. No answer. I checked her apartment, empty. Her social media accounts? Deleted. She had vanished like smoke. At first, I panicked. I called the bank, the police, even her mother, who claimed she hadn't spoken to her in months. But there was no trace. The loan payments fell to me. The landlord issued an eviction notice. Staff quit. Customers drifted away. Within weeks, Poor Decisions was a boarded-up memory. And I was left alone with debt, shame, and a silence that burned deeper than anger. My friends told me to sue, to post her name online, to ruin her reputation, but I didn't. I just shut down. For months, I barely got out of bed. I took odd jobs, wrote grant applications in cafes, studied business law in free night classes. It wasn't about revenge, not yet. It was survival. I had to believe I could still make something of myself, even if the first dream had died. Slowly, painfully, I rebuilt. I started consulting for small businesses, helping others avoid the mistakes I had made. I stayed quiet, humble, hidden until one of those clients introduced me to an investor looking for a partner with grit. And somehow, that meeting turned into a new opportunity, a new business. This time, I owned everything: the name, the structure, the numbers. No partners. No blind trust. I named the business Kindling and Vine because some fires are meant to be started over. It grew faster than I ever expected. Within 2 years, I had a staff of 10, a loyal clientele, and investors watching closely. But I never told anyone about Paige. I had folded that part of my life into a drawer I rarely opened. Until the day she walked in. It was a crisp Monday morning in early spring when I walked into my office balancing a coffee and a stack of grant proposals, distracted and already planning the week ahead, when my assistant looked up with a strange expression. "There's a walk-in asking to speak with someone about a business loan," she said quietly. She said it's urgent, but I think you'll want to see her yourself. I gave her a questioning glance, but she only tilted her head toward the seating area, and when I turned, I felt my pulse drop to my heels. Paige, sitting there like time had barely touched her, though she looked thinner, more tired, wearing an outfit that tried too hard to look expensive, but didn't hide the frayed seams. She hadn't seen me yet. She was flipping through a cheap portfolio binder, her nails tapping anxiously on the vinyl. For a moment, I thought about walking out, turning around and letting someone else deal with her. But something deeper held me in place. Not anger, not shock, but a cold curiosity. What story had she prepared? What version of reality was she living in now? I approached quietly, and when she finally looked up, her face froze. Her lips parted as if to speak, but no words came. I smiled, not kindly, but not cruelly either. Just enough to let her know the balance had shifted. "I hear you're looking for a loan," I said calmly, motioning for her to follow me. She stood without a word and followed me into my office like a ghost. Once the door closed behind us, the silence stretched. I let her sit. I didn't offer water. I didn't ask how she'd been. She finally broke first. "Liana." I didn't expect, but I cut her off with a small wave of my hand. "Tell me about your business plan," I said. She blinked, clearly thrown, but opened the binder. She stumbled through a pitch, something about a mobile wine truck, nostalgic branding, artisanal offerings. I recognized pieces of our old dream in her words, twisted now into something soulless. She needed funding, quickly, because no banks would take her without a cosigner. She was out of savings. Investors weren't responding. Her voice wavered as she explained that she'd tried everything. And then she looked at me with that same old glint, the one that used to get her out of parking tickets and into exclusive clubs. I thought maybe we could help each other again. I didn't flinch. I didn't raise my voice. I simply leaned back and said, "And the money from Poor Decisions? Is that how you funded this dream?" Her face cracked. She looked down. I was desperate. "I thought you'd be fine. You always were the strong one." I laughed softly, not out of humor, but disbelief. "You thought I'd be fine. After you emptied the account, vanished, left me to take the fall for your theft and your silence. She tried to speak, but I stopped her again. You didn't just steal money, Paige. You stole a future. My future. And now you're here, asking for a favor. The silence that followed was different this time, heavy, irreversible. She looked older now. Smaller. The confidence that had once defined her now hung around her like a tattered coat. I made mistakes, she whispered. But I'm trying to fix things. I stared at her a moment longer, then smiled once more. Good, I said. Because now I get to decide whether you get another chance. And unlike you, I document everything. I didn't give her an answer that day. I told her I'd review the proposal like I would any other applicant, and she left my office with a forced thank you and trembling hands. But the moment the door shut behind her, I pulled up every file I had access to: credit checks, previous business filings, public records, anything that would help me understand how low she had sunk. What I found was even worse than I imagined. She had started 2 other ventures after she disappeared, both registered under fake names and both ended in lawsuits and unpaid debts. She had bounced from state to state, trying to recapture the spark she once had with me, but she never could replicate it. She had no credibility left, no stability, no network. Just desperation and designer knockoffs. I documented everything, collected every inconsistency in her pitch, every hole in her numbers, every piece of proof that this was not a woman ready to rebuild. This was someone still looking for shortcuts. And then I began to plan. I didn't want to ruin her in public, not yet. I wanted her to see what fairness looked like from the other side. So I invited her back the following week and asked her to walk me through the numbers again, this time with someone from my finance team present. She hesitated, but agreed, her voice shaky but pretending to be bold. She must have thought I was warming up to her again, that my questions meant interest instead of quiet strategy. As she spoke, I could see her old charm trying to shine, those dramatic pauses, the bright-eyed vision casting, the way she glanced at me for approval like we were still partners. I said little, just nodded, took notes, and waited. Afterward, I told her we'd need her to submit financials, references, and a signed declaration of past debts. Her smile faltered for the first time. Is that really necessary? She asked. I thought, you know me. I met her eyes and replied smoothly, exactly. That's why it's necessary. She left without another word. Over the next week, her paperwork trickled in, delayed, incomplete, and riddled with contradictions. My team flagged everyone. I kept everything in a neat little folder labeled with her name, not for revenge, but for control. For closure. I was finally holding the pen in a story she thought she had finished. When she emailed me 2 weeks later asking if there was any update, I responded kindly, formally, the way one would address a stranger. We're still reviewing your application. Thank you for your patience. I wondered if she could feel the distance in my words, the absence of warmth where once there had been nothing but sisterhood. And then, without warning, she showed up again. No appointment. Just tears, panic, and a shaky voice in my waiting room, begging to speak to me privately. My assistant looked to me for direction, and I took a long breath before agreeing. This wasn't part of my plan, not yet, but maybe it was time to show her just how much I had changed. She followed me into my office again, but this time she didn't sit. She stood near the door, wringing her hands like she used to do during exams in college. Only now there was nothing left to memorize or perform, only the reality she had crafted for herself through lies and cowardice. She said she was sorry, over and over again, that she didn't know what she was doing back then, that the pressure, the fear, the temptation, it had all clouded her judgment. That she thought I would bounce back because I always landed on my feet, while she didn't know how to climb without stepping on someone. Her voice cracked in all the right places, and maybe, once upon a time, that would have broken me open, pulled out my forgiveness like water through a crack in stone. But not now. Not after everything. I let her speak, let her pour out the confession she thought would win back my sympathy. But when she finally paused and looked at me with that desperate hope in her eyes, I didn't return it. I asked her one simple question: if I had failed, if I had lost everything and stayed down, would you have ever looked back? Her silence told me more than any apology could. I stood slowly and walked to the window behind my desk, watching the city move, so alive and impersonal, a million stories crossing beneath my feet. Do you know what it took to rebuild? I asked quietly. How many nights I worked until I couldn't feel my fingers? How many rejections I swallowed because no one wanted to back a girl whose first business failed due to poor partner decisions? She looked down, ashamed, maybe just too tired to fight the truth. I came here today because I didn't know where else to go, she said finally. I thought, maybe there was something still between us. I turned to face her and said, there is. A debt. Her mouth opened in protest, but I raised a hand. Not a financial one. I've rebuilt. I'm fine. But there is a debt of trust, of integrity, of the years I lost cleaning up your mess. And you don't repay that by asking for more. Her expression collapsed. Whatever mask she'd held onto crumbled at once, and for a moment she looked like the girl I once knew, vulnerable, real, lost. But I couldn't carry her again. I had carried her long enough. I reached into my drawer and pulled out the folder, the neat little dossier we'd built of her falsehoods and failures. You can have this, I said. It's everything we've collected. Use it to rebuild if you want. Use it to remember what not to repeat. But not with my help. Not anymore. She took it with shaking hands, not even thanking me, just nodding slowly as if still trying to understand that the answer wasn't not yet, but never again. She left quietly, and I stood in the silence she left behind, not triumphant, not bitter, just steady. I had chosen boundaries over vengeance, and that was its own kind of power. The next few days passed with an odd quietness, the kind that comes after a storm has shifted course, but left the air heavy and strange. I didn't tell anyone on my team who she was. To them, she had been just another struggling applicant turned away by our internal review. But inside me, something was still unraveling, not in chaos, but in a deliberate way, like a thread being pulled slowly from a tightly wound spool. I thought that would be the end of it. I thought she would take that folder, disappear again, maybe finally face the consequences of the bridges she had burned. But then came the email. A long, rambling message sent to my work inbox at 2:17 a.m. titled Closure. She wrote about the spiral she had fallen into after poor decisions collapsed, how she had tried to start over, failed, tried again, lied again, and eventually believed her own fabrications. She said she had never wanted to hurt me, that in her mind, I would survive anything, and so she excused herself from accountability because it was easier than owning the wreckage. But what struck me most was the final line. You rebuilt without me, and maybe that's what you were meant to do all along. I stared at those words for a long time, rereading them until they stopped sounding like guilt and started sounding like truth. I hadn't just survived her betrayal. I had transformed because of it. I replied only once, simply saying, "Take care of yourself." I already am. After that, the silence became permanent. Months passed. Kindling and Vine continued to thrive. I launched a second location across town, hired 3 new team members, and finalized a partnership with a local vineyard to co-produce a house label. There were nights I stayed late in the office, the same way I had in the early days of poor decisions, but now it felt different. Not like desperation, like ownership, like peace. And then, one afternoon, as I was preparing for a meeting with investors, my assistant brought in a thick envelope addressed to me by hand. Inside was a short note and a check, an actual cashier's check, for exactly half the amount that had been drained from our account years ago. The note simply read, "This isn't enough. I know that. But it's something. I sold the truck idea to someone else. I thought you should be the first to know." I sat there holding that piece of paper like it might vanish if I blinked. Not because I needed the money, I didn't, but because of what it meant. She had sold the idea. She had owned her choices, however late. She had tried to give back what she stole, not just in dollars, but in dignity. I never replied. I deposited the check into a fund I had set up years ago for first-time female entrepreneurs, especially those starting over after a failed partnership. I named the fund anonymously, but in my heart, I knew who it was for. Not for Paige. For the girl I once was, hopeful, naive, and willing to risk everything for a dream shared with the wrong person. I didn't tell anyone where the funds came from. It didn't matter. What mattered was that it was no longer about her, no longer about revenge or repayment or even recognition. It was about what I had done with the pain, how I had turned it into purpose. Life didn't give me justice in the way I once fantasized about. No dramatic courtroom scenes, no social media expose, no public apology. Just this quiet resolution, slow and real, earned one hard decision at a time. And in that quiet, I found something more powerful than winning. I found peace, the kind that comes not from forgetting the past, but from outgrowing it. 1 year after Paige walked into my office for the last time, I found myself standing behind the podium at a small but elegant awards ceremony hosted by the Women in Business Alliance. I hadn't expected to win anything that night. I'd been nominated for Emerging Entrepreneur of the Year, but I assumed the recognition would go to someone flashier, someone who chased headlines and venture capital spotlights. I was the quiet kind of success, steady, deliberate, understated. But when they called my name, I walked to the stage on legs that remembered every late night, every broken promise, every moment I doubted I could rebuild what she had taken. I looked out at the crowd and saw my team at the corner table, smiling, clapping, unaware of how far this journey had stretched beneath the surface. I took the glass plaque with both hands, smiled for the photo, and turned to the microphone. I hadn't prepared a speech, not really. Just a few ideas scribbled on the back of a napkin I'd stuffed into my purse earlier that day. But when I opened my mouth, the words came easier than I expected. I talked about resilience, not the kind people write in bold headlines, but the quiet, unglamorous kind. The kind that shows up when no one's watching, when you're cleaning out your office at midnight after someone you loved walked away with your dream in her pocket. I spoke about failure, how it doesn't always look like bankruptcy or scandal. Sometimes it looks like misplaced trust. Sometimes it's invisible to the world, but loud in your chest. And I spoke about forgiveness, not as a gift you give someone else, but as the freedom you give yourself when you choose not to carry their weight any longer. There were tears in a few eyes when I stepped down, but I wasn't crying. Not anymore. I had done all my grieving in silence, and this was not a funeral. This was a birth of something better, wiser, and entirely mine. After the ceremony, a young woman came up to me. She looked barely 22, nervous, hopeful, with the wide-eyed energy of someone on the edge of her first real step. She said she wanted to open a cafe bookstore with her roommate, but wasn't sure how to protect herself if it didn't work out. I smiled and told her the truth, put everything in writing. Split responsibilities clearly. And trust your gut, not everyone who dreams with you wants the same kind of morning. She laughed, but she nodded like she understood. That moment, small, simple, felt like a full circle. Not because I was fixing someone else's path, but because I had finally owned mine. I went home that night, slipped off my heels, poured a glass of the house red from my second location, and sat on the balcony of my apartment that overlooked the old neighborhood where poor decisions had once lived. That building had been turned into a dog grooming spa, of all things. The old brick was still there, but the sign was different, and the windows glowed with a completely new kind of light. I stared at it and smiled. Not with bitterness, but gratitude. That chapter was over. It hadn't ended cleanly or kindly, but it had given me a beginning I never would have imagined for myself. And most of all, it had shown me the difference between shared ambition and shared integrity. One can be borrowed. The other must be built. I had built mine from scratch. Brick by brick. Scar by scar. And in doing so, I had written the kind of ending she never could have stolen, because it wasn't an ending at all. It was mine to keep, to grow, to tell. It's been 3 years now, and I hardly think of her anymore. Not out of hatred, but because life is filled with too many better things to leave room for ghosts. Kindling and Vine now has 3 locations, each with its own flavor, but the same soul: welcoming, warm, intentional. I lead a team of 34 women and men who believe in building together, who show up not just for the paycheck, but for the pride of something real. We host mentorship nights for young entrepreneurs, and every year I award 2 grants to women starting their first ventures. I never ask their stories. I don't need to. I see it in their eyes, that flicker of hope dimmed by betrayal, or fear, or simply being told they're too small to matter. I give them space to matter. And in doing that, I heal the part of myself that once thought being left behind meant being unworthy. My parents still ask about Paige from time to time. They always liked her. She was charming at Sunday dinners and had a laugh that made people lean in. I tell them only what's needed. She's doing her own thing now. They nod, and we change the subject. Because they don't need to know that forgiveness doesn't always include reunion. Sometimes it just means choosing not to bleed anymore. I never responded to the second check she sent. It came in quietly one spring morning, this time with no note, no explanation, just numbers and a signature. I added it to the fund again, this time expanding our outreach to include financial literacy seminars for women exiting toxic business relationships. There are more of us than you'd think. One night, while walking through the new location downtown, I paused in the wine aisle and saw a bottle with a familiar label, our old one, Poor Decisions, now revived under a new brand by someone who had bought the name. I held it in my hands and smiled, not because it hurt, but because it didn't. Not anymore. I left it on the shelf and walked back to my office, where a new partner waited, someone I trust, someone who never needed to steal to feel strong. She asked me, "Do you ever regret it?" I looked around the room filled with light and laughter and dreams that were finally safe, and I said, only that I didn't rebuild sooner. Because what I have now isn't just success. It's freedom. And that no one can ever take from me again.